Good morning, everyone. My name is Finn Fehrenbach, and I'm a third-year student here at Colorado Law School. I'm happy to be introducing today's first panel, AI Market Forces, a new gap in tech access. The panel will be moderated by Professor Harry Surden, an expert in artificial intelligence and the law. He is joined by Elettra Bietti, assistant professor of law and computer science at Northeastern University School of Law, Asad Ramzanali, Director of Artificial Intelligence and Tech Policy at Vanderbilt Policy Accelerator. Joining us virtually is Howard Shelanski, Professor of Antitrust Law and Trade Regulation at Georgetown Law School. Christopher Yu, Professor in Law and Technology, Communication and Computer and Information Science at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. And last but not least, Richard Witt, President of GliaNet Alliance. So please join me in welcoming the panel.
Thank you, Finn, for that excellent introduction. So welcome to our panel. I'm Harry Surden, law professor here at Colorado Law, and I have the pleasure of moderating this panel. I will also be helping to organize our AI conference, which will be on March 6th, not May 6th, just to clarify that date, and I hope to see you all there. Thanks for joining me on this really timely topic on AI market forces. Ever since the emergence of ChatGPT just a little over 3 years ago, AI has been getting more and more performative in terms of its ability to do knowledge work. And it has been improving about, in my estimation, about 10% each year cumulative on the previous year. And today we see 3 dominant AI large language model systems that form the backbone, the foundation of a lot of today's systems. ChatGPT from OpenAI, Claude from Anthropic, and Gemini from Google. And some look at this as a moment of concern. Behind these names, which might not be familiar, are some familiar names of the tech world. OpenAI famously is funded by tech giant Microsoft. Behind Claude are large investments from Amazon and Google, and then Google has their own model, Gemini. Meta continues to influence, spend a lot of money in the AI realm. And beneath all of this are production chips from NVIDIA and Taiwan Semiconductor, which have a near virtual control of the market. So on this one view, this is a critical moment to intervene and ensure that any benefits of the AI moment are distributed and to ensure robust competition. But there's another perspective we'll be seeing, and others see this as a moment of restraint. By many measures, we're early in the AI lifecycle. Only 4 years ago, large language models were actually not that performative at all, so much so that most of us have never heard of these AI systems. The technology is changing month to month. So the last AI conference that we had in April here was on AI agents. I stood up here, I showed AI agents programming, and it was good, but not that good. Fast forward 8 months now, we have AI agents which are able to program autonomously, like Claude and Codex from OpenAI, and they're able to produce really performant, accurate systems in just 8 months. We are now seeing very competitive models, open weights models, largely from China, 3 to 4 very performative systems that are only 3 to 4 months behind in terms of performance. The frontier models, a year ago, we really didn't have competitive models. So in this view, sees this as a moment of restraint, that intervention might do more harm than good, given that we're possibly early on in a life cycle and we might nudge it down the wrong path unintentionally. So to discuss these topics, we have an incredible panel. I know Finn introduced, but we have Asad Ramzanali, Director of Artificial Intelligence and Technology Policy, Elettra Bietti, Professor in Law at Northeastern, Christopher Yu, Professor in Law and Technology at University of Pennsylvania Carey School of Law, Richard Witt, President of GliaNet Alliance, and for our first question, joining us remotely, Howard Shelanski, Professor of Law at Georgetown Law. So the first question for our panel will go to Howard. So Howard, where do you see antitrust concerns arising in the LLM space today, if at all? You've suggested that we need to move beyond traditional Section 2 monopolization analysis, which is legalese for antitrust intervention, and take a more holistic ecosystem view of AI markets. And what would you say, what does that mean concretely? Where would you focus your scrutiny in light of the technology? Should we be concerned about this potential tech dominance of the familiar players in the space? And where do you see things going? So Howard, turning it over to you.
Thanks very much, Harry. Am I coming through okay?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. I'm very sorry I can't be there in person, but I'm delighted to join all of you today. Look, Harry, it's a very, very good question. Right now, if you look at the ecosystem, it looks like there are three major players. These are actually players of very distinct structure. You've got, Anthropic coming out as sort of an LLM player without the benefits of a lot of history and integration into other kinds of platform services. Similarly with OpenAI, although they have had an alliance or a financial arrangement with Microsoft, although I would note that has transformed dramatically over the years, and the financial structure is very different than it was in 2018, 2019 with the initial investment. And then you have Google, of course, which comes from a position of Judge Mehta's words, not mine, dominance in search, and obviously has certain kinds of advantages that can come into play. So, what do I think about antitrust in this universe where we're looking at three large frontier models that seem to be the leading players? It is tempting on one hand to reach back and to quote then FTC Chair Bill Kennard when he was being asked in 1999 to regulate the emerging broadband players. And Bill said, I'm not going to regulate anything. We don't have a monopoly. We don't have a duopoly. We have a noopoly. Let's let this thing develop. It's tempting to do that. I think we need to be a little bit more cautious when it comes to the current ecosystem, and here's why. It is very layered and integrated ecosystem. This is not a situation where frontier models can just sort of pop out there, run on your computer, and compete unrestrained based on the performance of their models. Yes, that's part of what happens, but to get to that level of performance, they need many different kinds of inputs. I'll just focus on two for simplicity right now. One is compute, and the other is training data. And if you don't have access to very consistent supplies of large amounts of both of those things, the ability to develop a performant large language model and to move towards generative AI is going to be challenging. So you need to not just make sure that there isn't some kind of tipping to use of the LLM on the retail side, for lack of a better term. You have to make sure that there isn't foreclosure or hurdles to the key inputs that these LLMs need right now. And that's why I think we're talking about, for lack of a better term, an ecosystem in which we have to look at the interrelationship amongst all of the parts. Now, before I go on, I want to note 2 points. One is I am going to take an agnostic position to the excellent points that Brett Frischman, wonderful to see Brett, made in his keynote address, right? Antitrust, we're agnostic. You want more cigarettes? We're going to give you more and cheaper. You want more awful soft drinks? We're going to give you more and cheaper. We are agnostic as to that. So I'm going to assume that what we're asking about is how do we make sure this ecosystem develops so we get more LLMs faster? I fully appreciate there's a very important social debate that we must have about that question. The second thing I need to do is offer a disclosure. I have provided paid legal advice to OpenAI, so would just like to disclose that most publicly in the role that they played as a third party in the Google remedies phase, the Google search remedies phase, where they had a witness at trial that I was involved with prepping and presenting. So just want that disclosure out there. Okay, so what do we need to think about? I think what we need to think about is ensuring that there to the extent that the closed, the sort of black box form, not open parameter, but closed parameter leading LLMs that have the largest user share right now can continue to compete and sort of trade-off position in the marketplace, I think we have to look carefully not just at the current market shares, but at the vertical relationships that those firms have, the access they have to certain kinds of data, their willingness to provide that access to third parties who might not be able to get into their systems for that data. So, for example, you need video training data. Does Google have an advantage because of YouTube? You need compute. Does somebody who has a very long-term massive supply agreement with NVIDIA have an advantage? We don't necessarily know the answer to these questions because the ability to use synthetic data, sources of data, are shifting all of the time. Different forms of compute, and of course, the ability of DeepSeek to come into the market just a few months behind with an open parameter model that ran on far lighter weight compute, raise questions about, we shouldn't necessarily assume that you have to have supply with the current suppliers, but I do think we need to have a competition policy that looks not just at the actions that these firms are taking in their contracting practices vis-a-vis users, but their access to data and their upstream and downstream supply agreements. Right now, my view is we don't know enough to say, for example, that, oh my gosh, we're moving into a triopoly. We need to start regulating this environment from a competitive standpoint. I do think, however, that we need to have, I think, a very careful and thoughtful look at what happens when Google signs an agreement with Apple to have Gemini be the white-labeled AI that powers, Siri. Does that start to default into voice assistant search for Google? Is that a way of preventing the very kinds of dynamism that Judge Mehta articulated in his Google search remedies opinion when he said, I don't need to stop Google from purchasing defaults because this is such a dynamic ecosystem that pretty soon the AI upstarts will be able to outbid Google for those defaults. Well, I think we should ask a question of whether the kinds of agreements that are being formed now, before the new players are able to outcompete Google for paying for those defaults, I think we need to ask a hard question about whether that dynamism might be prevented before it fully develops. Does that mean that I think there's necessarily something wrong with a lot of the agreements we're seeing out there in the marketplace? I don't know the facts. I don't know enough. But I would say it's something that as a regulator who could gain access to those facts that I would want to look at. Because I think without preserving the dynamism that's in this space, we will wind up with a relatively limited set of players, and we will wind up with very integrated product bundles that may or may not interoperate, and we might not get the full benefit of the innovation competition that Brett referred to at the end of his talk. That would be, truly beneficial for the ecosystem. And I fully agree, not all friction prevents innovation competition or impedes it. Sometimes you need a little bit of friction to keep it open, and I think that should be the focus of competition policy going forward. Just one final note on the Chinese open parameter models. There are many of them, not just DeepSeek. A very interesting question about whether, as a global matter, those are viewed as more or less trustworthy from a data standpoint than, for example, the closed models of the existing tech platforms. I do think that they have the potential to be very powerful competitors, but of course, trade policy and various kinds of other things may limit the degree to which they can fully compete in the US market. So I do think we need to think about competition in AI models, not just in an antitrust standpoint, but we need to think about who we allowed to come into our marketplace. Are restrictions good? Are they bad? From a variety of different perspectives before we reflexively rule those models out of competing down the road in our ecosystem. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Howard. Those were extremely helpful remarks. And one theme in there I just want to emphasize is the importance of regulators and analysts understanding the underlying technology. So what Howard did, which I really appreciate, rather than taking a simple market dominance approach in terms of sales, he said, well, let's understand the underlying technological inputs that this technology brings, this large language model technology, the compute, and the data, and scrutinize those. And our regulators or those who may want to or not want to be involved need to understand these nuances, and I really appreciate that. So let me throw the same question out to the panel. Chris?
Actually, I go by Christopher. My wife is named Chris.
Sorry, Christopher.
So the question and Howard's answer really stemmed on this word ecosystem. And I really am, I have an article in the Network Law Review actually analyzing this, because this is an item that's shown up in the 2024 EU guidelines on market definition. And whenever I hear the word ecosystem, I try to figure out what is it and what do we learn from it. And so what they define is, according to this, is it's similar to aftermarkets and bundles, but it may be different. And they talk about how it may be different. Well, things that don't matter: network effects, switching costs, multi-homing. And I find myself deeply puzzled by this, because until they tell me how it's different, I really don't know. Network effects are often used incorrectly as equating to winner take all. And the answer is, if you actually look at the literature on network effects, they say that it can actually cause technologies to change too quickly as well as too slow. It's actually, there's two opposing network externalities. By joining a network, you actually create benefits for the new network that you don't internalize. You also impose costs on the old network you're leaving with that you don't internalize. And they say that, in fact, it's an empirical question about which of those effects dominates. And so just assuming that that's going to go in one way, actually, if you look empirically, doesn't work out either. The notion of multi-homing, if you multi-home, it's not winner take all, you're both. And so you see this real ambiguity, and it's been a real puzzle to try to figure out how that would play into this. The other definition comes out of an academic piece by Jacopides and Lianos, which is frequently cited. They talk about these complementary products. That's really about, we're talking about the monopoly or the potential triopoly in the AI generators, the frontier models. Most of this stuff is about the complementers who are building on the models. And that's really what Jacopides and Lianos go to. We know that the vertical, well, first is they talk about central position and paramount importance. And this is why we abandoned the structured conduct performance paradigm in antitrust, which is raw size is ultimately ambiguous. It can be the result of anti-competitive activity. It can also be the result of successful competition on the merits, which is why we always have an exclusionary conduct element to separate the two of when it's a result of bad acts and good acts. We have to make sure that that works. But what's also fascinating to me is when you're talking about complementary products, the lesson of the last 50 years of vertical integration theory is this is ambiguous. And I'll give you two concrete examples. One is the seminal article by Tim Bresnahan and Mark Trachtenberg on general purpose technologies makes the point that if you build a platform, you actually create benefits for the complementers you don't internalize. Their recommendation is to allow the platform creator to vertically integrate into complementary services more so that they can actually internalize it. Now, there's always going to be an optimal balance, and I'm not saying that means you let them do it forever. The other one that I think is fascinating is David Teese's famous article on profiting from innovation, is that there is a timing element about sunk cost opportunism, which is, hey, if you are going to develop a technology, but you're going to have to negotiate with other inputs, and anytime you're doing this, it's never a finished product if it's a frontier model. If you sink the costs before you negotiate with them, you're screwed. Because after the costs are sunk, they're going to beat you up in negotiations. Teese's recommendation, and this is an article that's had like a whole symposium written about it, it's very well interested, it's generated a lot of interest, is to enter into a strategic partnership early on so that you can actually be governed by the ex-ante bargaining power instead of the ex-post. So what I see here is a very complicated reality where these sorts of ecosystems actually can yield huge benefits. What we really need is clear definitions and really a means for sorting out when it's good and when it's bad. And unfortunately, the ecosystem discussion at this point, I think, obscures more than it enlightens, and it needs a little bit more development. And it makes me wonder, it makes me cautious about how it's being used.
Okay, yeah, great point. So just to summarize a little bit what you said, what I'm hearing is that some of things that might superficially seem like concerns actually might be some optimal structures for these things to flourish for some of these interconnecting deals out there. Richard.
Yeah, thanks, Harry. Great to be back at Flatirons this year. I believe Howard did a nice job of laying out some of the potentially relevant factors to look at in this maybe broader ecosystem approach, including the idea of sort of the vertical relationships, who's paying who behind the scenes. I think one other relevant factor to put on the table is simply the business model. Where do they get their money on the front end in terms of customers? And we now have three fairly distinct approaches. So Google has now taken the AI, the Gemini capability, it's embedding it in everything, right? And of course, Google is operating under what I've been calling for a while now, the SEAMS paradigm, which stands for surveillance, extraction, analysis, manipulation. So it's the core platform of the web. It's what not just Google, but many of the larger companies have abided by for many years. Surveillance capitalism, another way you can put it from Shoshana Zuboff. But that is where Google is. That's, I think, where they're going to be going forward. They're going to make a lot of their money from not just the front end with the consumers, but also with the sort of the data, the operators in the back end, the data brokers, advertisers, et cetera. OpenAI, until recently, was sort of in this camp where Sam Altman was uneasily saying, I think we don't need to go down the advertising road. Now they very much are. Within the last 2-3 weeks, Sam has made it very clear they're going to be more or less adopting, again, what I call the SEAMS paradigm, moving in the direction of the other, basically the way the web has been set up over the last 20 years. Anthropic of the big three is in a very interesting state. They don't have any of that right now. They mostly focus on enterprise customers and business APIs. And actually, I use Claude a fair amount, and I've asked Claude, what do you think about the way you're setting yourselves up? And he has this constitution, right, that's been set up, and you can take it with a grain of salt if you like. But his perspective, for what it's worth, is like, yeah, we set ourselves apart because we want to have the consumers see us as a more friendly place where we're not selling your data, brokering to third parties, trying to influence your behaviors. Again, take with whatever grains of salt you want. But I guess the larger point is simply there are potentially three different models now in terms of how the web paradigm is being incorporated or not into these three major systems.
I think I'll wait.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't think I have too much more to add.
Okay, yeah, I'll just add one more thing, which is in terms of this rapidly changing landscape, right now, AI systems for training are really compute and data inefficient because of our current paradigms. So to train something like ChatGPT requires roughly a trillion pages of data, but there's been a lot of algorithmic innovations recently that could make these systems much more, they call it sample efficient, data efficient, where they might require 1/10 or 1/1,000,000th of that same data. Same thing with compute. So it's interesting to see how these compute and data efficiencies might change the landscape in 5 years due to breakthroughs that are coming. Okay, great first question. Let me throw the second question out to Christopher. And this is sort of the other viewpoint here. There's a view we might simply be too early in the AI lifecycle to just draw strong conclusions about market structure and dominance in the AI space. And for instance, only a fraction of users have adopted AI, even though it seems like AI is everywhere. In some sense, it's also not that common. The players are shifting constantly. The dominant players today were not necessarily the dominant players 3 and 5 years ago. The technology of today is very different. So what's your perspective on this, Christopher?
So, you pointed out, put it very nicely, which is what we care about, and this really shows up in the network effects literature, is not the market we have today. It's the market we're going to get at maturity. So if you have a new technology, we have that familiar adoption curve where it starts slowly and it goes up this way. The first actor is going to have 100% market share. And we could look at that and analyze, well, this is a problem. We don't really know what's going to happen. And in fact, we can look at the number of free customers, and even if you're small, if there's 95% of the market hasn't adopted yet, you're free to contest for them in a greenfield way. And so you see a very interesting set of dynamics about when you analyze a market, you have to know where you are in the adoption cycle and see how it goes. And the funny thing is, it's fascinating when I think about, Richard talking about asking Claude, do we really know how this market is going to shake out? So I keep on thinking about the great philosopher Yogi Berra, who says, prediction is hard, especially about the future. Like, I wish I could sit here and tell you, I know what the future is going to be, and we can worry about this. And if I had the ability, or if any of us had the ability to do that, we are wasting our time here. We should be cashing our checks and sipping margaritas someplace beautiful. And the number of times in the tech industry, I've heard people say with great confidence when something's going to happen a certain way, we all know that's not the case. So what are the possible worlds we could end up with? We could see these three companies bashing each out. We could see it working out that way. I'm fascinated by we talk about Google. When I hear people talk about this in Silicon Valley, it's charitable to call them as part of the three. I mean, they regard them as behind and really struggling, but be that as it may, that's one possible outcome. What's another possible outcome? There's a whole bunch of writing right now, really epitomized to me by, I think it's a Goldman Sachs article, all this investment, where's the revenue? Is that we are seeing a huge speculative bubble reminiscent of the dot-com bubble of '99, where you don't see payable business models. I don't think the $20 per subscriber per month is not going to do it. And that we're going to see a radical shakeout of this at some point. And you're going to see that, in fact, that this may not yield the kind of benefits we think about. We may see that we talked a bit about data and the availability of data. The initial models were trained largely on information scraped from the publicly available internet. So the idea that there's some huge monopoly or ability to exclude people from doing that, if that's the source, is unlikely. But more interestingly, the big jump in what you learn is the nonlinearities, and when you ingest things into LLMs, that was the big chunk of data. There's no other big chunk out there. And seeing how this diffusion curve is going to move forward is not at all clear. But then, as Harry is talking about, you see this other movement that says the way AI is going is to train models on smaller amounts of higher quality data, either in terms of fewer errors or more focused or fit for purpose models that aren't trying to do everything to everybody, but something that will warm the hearts of all of us who are in law school. They're trying to do things specific to the legal domain, where they're not trying to do everything for everybody. And so you can see all these different worlds where there's coming out, and we see, even aside from specificity, things like DeepSeek, they're saying is, do I really need the entire universe of data that I have to run this model, which is a big chunk of how they reduce compute. We're seeing new analytical solutions that require much less compute, that require less data, that may play out in very radical different ways. Now, are there stories that could be bad? Yeah, I think so. But the question is do we know at this point what those are going to be to step in? Now, the other way I'd think about this is what would a good environment for this look like? We'd want new entrants, we'd want lots of investment, and in fact, we want people experimenting with different solutions. You know, do we want homogeneous Me Too things among the different actors and different things? And when you start to look at this, Anthropic and OpenAI are two, if not the biggest, I think they're the biggest startups in history. And that we see new actors that didn't exist before that are disrupting, and yes, we have some partnerships with OpenAI and Microsoft. The interesting question is, do we want a world in which there's no partnerships between any of these companies? And there's possibly, Howard says correctly, there may be problematic relationships. There may be possibly beneficial ones. And it could be that if Google is behind in number 3, maybe partnering with Siri is a way they can make it work. And there's examples I can give you of that from history. But the interesting question is, we have to think about the counterfactual. If we're worried about this world, what would we think a healthy emerging environment might look like? I might want 10 LLMs, frontier models. I don't think that's realistic. There's the structure of it is, the magic number, what we generally see from the econometrics is is 3. We talk about the rule of 3. If you look at it from a pricing standpoint, the huge benefits come from adding a second player to a market and a third player. The marginal benefits, yes, they're there, it's better, but they start to decline in diminishing marginal returns. And we discovered that we would love to see markets with 100 players. But my favorite example of this is NVIDIA. And when I go around the world they're talking about AI stack and AI sovereignty. Every country wants to be independent on AI. We have 190 recognized UN countries. We're not going to have 190 chip manufacturers. This is not going to happen. But the last comment I'll make, and this is something I was talking with Harry, is we have to think about this in sort of the long term and really think about how it's going to dynamically and in a skeptical, humble way. And to me, the classic example is NVIDIA. So NVIDIA is now one of the, if not the largest company by market cap. I didn't check today, but it's like right there. if not. And the differences don't really matter. You know, I saw the EU open investigations. I saw the FTC open investigations. There's an alternative explanation for NVIDIA. They're damn lucky. Why? They were doing graphics processing chips for a segment that is dying. That is laptops and desktops on something that's essentially becoming obsolete, that was doing parallel processing. That got bailed out a little bit by blockchain, and then AI comes. And just because they happen to have a product that was suited to a complementary technology that just happened to develop, they are doing very, very well. And this is like Forrest Gump surviving the hurricane. You know, sometimes you get lucky, right? You know, and that's fine. And according to Alcoa, luck, you know, this is not an antitrust problem. It happens. You know, there's a guy who bought land that was a bauxite mine, the best one in North America. You know, this just happens. Now, the better question is, how long do we expect that to last? Is there a moat around NVIDIA, or is AMD sees this, and this is normal, right? Which is, we said, short-run dislocation from a shift in demand caused by a new development is what attracts everyone to do it. You know AMD is working on a parallel processing chip right now. They said as much. How long is it going to take? How effective are they going to be? Who else is coming? That's the real question. You know, is to start to think about this in a more dynamic way and to try to understand how it's going to work out. Because if we look at it at the early stages by saying, well, NVIDIA's got 100%, we should whack them and take all the profitability out of the segment, we actually disrupt the very dynamics that are going to attract in this additional entry that we depend on for these markets to move forward.
Thank you, Christopher. That's a really interesting perspective that, right now, this is a dynamic space, and we might unintentionally, through action, nudge things down the wrong path. So advocating for restraint. One thing I really want to emphasize is your point about being skeptical about predictions. So less funny version of but maybe more accurate version of the Yogi Berra quote is, prediction is hard to do, especially about technology. And that's something I emphasize among my students. You can all do this exercise if you go back and look at what was being discussed at the dawn of the social media and smartphone age around 2008 and 2010 and see what the dominant concerns were. They, by and large, miss the concerns that we care about most today, like political polarization, misinformation, addiction, and mental health concerns. They were worried about other things, but they missed the big ones. And to me, that should invite some humbleness on our part about attempting to confidently predict the direction of technology and the problems. Not that there won't be problems, there are problems. It's just we're bad at predicting what those problems are, and we're most likely wrong. Let me throw this out, Elettra.
Sure. So I'm gonna maybe comment on both Howard and Christopher's interventions, because I think they put forward different kinds of legal institutional visions for AI. And so I want to put a third or a fourth vision on the table as well. Howard basically is arguing for moving away from traditional Section 2 of the Sherman Act antitrust review because it's too limited. It doesn't seem to be perhaps working. We've seen a couple of cases against big tech that have not ended well. We'll see what happens. The Meta decision is being appealed. But he's arguing for moving to an ecosystems-based understanding of what's going on in these markets. What I am still ambiguous on is whether he's arguing that a case-by-case type enforcement still should apply to these ecosystems, or whether we need a more holistic form of ex-ante, perhaps, regulation. And so just 2 days ago, Christopher and I were on another panel together talking about ex-ante pro-competitive regulation. And I think it's worth just putting ex-ante regulation on the table and thinking about what kinds of frameworks might need to be designed in a forward-looking way. And it cuts across, or it cuts against this question. Sorry.
So just for the non-legal people, would you mind explaining what you mean by ex-ante regulation?
Yes. So there's a kind of debate about whether we should regulate ex-ante or ex-post, right? So ex-ante regulation comes before the potential violation and creates a framework that creates some level of deterrence or nudges companies in some way to not violate certain restrictions, right? So not accumulate data or train data across different services, not prevent potential competitors from interoperating with upstream or downstream services that they control, for example, right? And antitrust ex post enforcement comes after the fact, right? And it questions the behavior of companies after a violation has occurred or after we have empirical evidence and we can assess that problematic behavior has occurred, right? And so I think there is space for thinking about intervening before the fact, or even if we're skeptical about intervening before the fact, experimenting with both an ex ante before the fact approach and an ex post approach. And that's because I am worried that the wait and see approach that Christopher puts forward allows incumbents in particular to accumulate too much power in a timeline where regulators are just unable to intervene, right? And just in the last few months, we've seen a number of announcements that should be concerning to us and that, you know, regulation could potentially prevent. So an example is that Apple will be sharing its Siri-related data with Google, and so the two companies were both incumbents are going to pool their data for the purpose of AI training of their models, and this will facilitate the position of Gemini in this kind of competitive battle with other models. Google is also now offering AI pricing functionality across the web, which is another way that they're kind of using their infrastructural advantages and infrastructural capacity to potentially control and plan the digital economy in some way, as Mestaller has commented on this by saying Google is becoming the new digital central planner. And then we have announcements about the sharing of data across different services that big tech companies use. So, for example, Google is using Gmail data to train their Gemini. Meta is using our Messenger information or our Instagram data to train their chatbot. And that should also be concerning to us potentially. And these are things that some ex-ante frameworks were meant to deal with ahead of time. It doesn't seem to work. So that is a serious concern, right? That, you know, just a few days ago, the European Commission issued some specification proceedings against Google because Google is denying interoperability to its third-party competitors, right? So even though there are rules out there written in the books, it seems like Google is totally bypassing them. And so there's a question about how do we design regulation today, right? But I just wanted to put the ex-ante alternative on the table.
No, I love that. And just to bring out some of the themes you brought up. So this is the question of, do we set up a series of rules ahead of time to prevent harm or deter harm, or do we wait for the harm to arise and then looking back, either deal with it one-on-one or create some rules based upon things that have happened? And one thing I like that you said, and I think it does what I understood Howard to say, is that to the extent there's an ex-ante rule, he would want access of data by regulators to be able to scrutinize things like the inputs to systems or some of these relationships that might create anti-competitive harms that they might not have access to today, which is sort of a softer version of ex-ante access than having rules. Asad.
Yeah, the thing I want to add a little bit to Christopher's point, I appreciated the what's the magic number, right? In a market that, and these are multiple markets we're talking about. I take your point on ecosystem can be a fuzzy idea. In the AI model market in particular, if you look at that, my kind of thought process is not what's the desirable number of competitors in the market or what's the idealized mature state of the market, but rather what's the state of the market where if there is an innovation in how models are developed, that a new entrant has the ability to enter. There are certain parts of that market that are going to pose barriers to entry, right? To your point about data, there's the compute costs, but there's a lot of other things that look more artificial, like exclusionary contracts, like the fact that we do have limited access to compute, like the fact that a lot of these deals that look like vertical integration, either within a company or through investments or through other types of financial arrangements, those can become limiting for the next company. I don't believe we've reached a technological maturity in what a model market looks like, but I worry that the economic arrangement of that market may force us to get to maturity faster than a new innovation might be able to actually do something about that market. So that's where I get a little bit worried about the things that I see in that market.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you know, the eternal question, what's the signal to intervene or not intervene? All right, Elettra, this question's for you. So emerging technologies have given new capabilities for companies to influence government and regulation beyond traditional concerns. So in recent work, you argue that technology platforms engage in forms of influence that go beyond what we've traditionally worried about from the private sector influencing the government, such as lobbying, contributions, or revolving doors, and increasingly engage what you call epistemic and technological capture. Can you say a little bit more about these new technological opportunities to influence or capture government? And then if that's right, and we have new ways of influencing government, where should we be concerned about problematic technological power concentrations?
Yeah, thanks so much. Also, I wanted to say thanks so much to the organizers for having us, and thanks, Harry, for moderating. So in the spirit of talking about growing asymmetries in information access and in access to AI functionality, I wanted to discuss tech companies and in particular AI companies growing power and how asymmetric that power is and potentially will be in the future. I really liked in the keynote by Brett Frischman, I really liked his point about the asymmetric ability to shut down information flows, right? The fact that the rich or the haves can extricate themselves from technological systems in a way that the have-nots cannot. And this kind of move from a landscape of scarcity, which I think many of you have operated in or thought about for a long time, to a world of information saturation and information oversupply, right? So I think that's really useful and important. I want to focus on a slightly different question on asymmetry, which is the asymmetry of power between governments and tech actors. And so that's really what this research that I've been doing recently with a political scientist is about. The paper is called Technological Capture, and it's basically an attempt to reframe the problem of regulatory capture in the tech industry from more traditional forms of lobbying, revolving doors, political donations, to new ways in which tech actors use their preferential control over technology, over knowledge creation to affect political processes and also regulatory processes. So beyond the kind of traditional forms of regulatory capture and influence, which have been studied at length and which obviously tech actors engage in, I talk about three other forms of influence. So the first is epistemic power or epistemic capture. And that's the power that tech companies have over information flows and knowledge creation, including their ability to withhold information from regulators in some contexts, to disseminate certain types of information, to flood the regulatory zone. So when we've seen this in antitrust proceedings, when they have a hard time arguing a case on the merits, sometimes tech actors tend to produce a lot of expert reports and flood the regulatory zone. And as we know, regulators don't have the same resources that tech companies have. And so sometimes it's really hard to navigate all that information. But there's also another kind of aspect of control over knowledge creation that is being exploited, I think, a lot by AI companies, which is this kind of creation of hype, right? If we don't do it, someone else will do it. We need to develop AI now so that we can solve all these issues from climate change to poverty to full employment. And so I think there's ways in which tech companies use their ability to control information to affect regulatory priorities and kind of regulation itself. Perhaps more relevant to this panel, there's two other forms of power that we worked on. So the first is what we call connective power, power over nodes in a network. And the final one is what we call architectural power or infrastructural power, if you will. So the first, connective power, is really the ability of platforms and infrastructural actors, so existing AI incumbents like Google, to control actors within their network. One example from kind of slightly outside of the AI debate is the TikTok case. So as many of you will know, there's been a bill, the divest or ban bill against TikTok, which now has led to an acquisition that we can talk about during breaks. But TikTok mobilized their users in against this regulation, right? So we had a lot of TikTokers who started opposing the legislation and saying we need to, our right to free speech, what is happening here? So that's a way in which connective power works, basically mobilizing users or actors that are controlled within a network, kind of entangled in a network controlled by the big tech company, to then advocate for the big tech company's interests. Attached to this idea of users is also the idea of controlling competitors in a kind of frenemy or co-opetition dynamic. So for instance, we've seen actors like Mozilla advocate against a Google Chrome divestment in the US v. Google search case, which is surprising because Mozilla offers a browser. So we would think that from a competition perspective, they would want a Chrome divestment. And it's really interesting how, because of these backdoor deals where Google actually shares revenues with these actors are so dependent on Google's monopoly that they prefer to have a monopoly rather than to have competition, right? So that's connective power. And then architectural power is the power to build infrastructure that influences regulators. And so a classic example is, say, end-to-end encryption, right? The fact that you build a messaging service that relies on end-to-end encryption changes the regulatory landscape because regulators cannot access the content. They cannot do certain things. They have to regulate differently, right? And in the AI context, I think this manifests as a power to exclude third parties. And I've already mentioned before the failure of Google to provide interoperability to third-party chatbots. Google possesses control over a lot of different segments of the digital economy. Howard was talking about, compute and training data, right? Preferential access over compute and training data. And I think there's an additional aspect, which is control over the user-facing or the customer-facing interfaces and infrastructures, right? And so that allows Google to then exclude third-party players who are competitors on the AI landscape, but now cannot access users. And so preferential access to users is something that, that is favoring incumbents. So I think I'll leave it here. Just wanted to say that broadly what I think is important to think about is the fact that regulators are operating in a landscape that is shaped, curated, and molded by tech actors. And so when we're talking about how to regulate this landscape, we do need to think about the ways in which regulation is influenced by the actors who are developing the technology.
Yeah, I love this work and I love this point because I do think you've shown that the technology gives new powers. And one of the best examples I like from your work is about how technology can shape the discourse on ideas broadly. So say regulation. If you're, X or Twitter and you want to change the discourse and regulation, you can start showing examples in user feeds of regulation failing, and meanwhile in the background, the silent examples of regulation working are not promoted. So millions of users get this impression that regulation is bad and that regulation has to end and has to change, and that's kind of using the power of dissemination to change the discourse in ways that are preferential for the company. And I think that's a really important aspect. Let me open up any reactions to Elettra's point of view. Christopher?
Well, okay. So I find this fascinating. The structure, the 4-part structure you lay out. I find myself wanting to understand how it would work. And so, one of the biggest moments I had as a young scholar is someone to ask me a question, what data could I show you that would change your mind? And it's really asking us to think, within these factors, there's almost always tension. Look, sometimes there's only one consideration. Those debates don't last very long. We just max it out and we're done. Usually there's a balance of 2 things fighting with each other. And the question then becomes is, okay, how do we balance that? So one of the things we talk about, this openness, one of the things I loved is, connectivity is not always a bad thing. There's some good in it. There's potentially and they're suggesting that there's some things that could be abusive. How do we sort this out? How do we sort out? Yes, they control the access to the information, the architecture. That's true of anyone who innovates. And the question then is, they have to decide how they're going to deploy the architecture and whether they're going to use an open one or a closed one. And that's an interesting strategic decision. So there's a lovely business school literature looking, I'm old enough, if the IBM PC days of the 80s. A lot of people here are too young to remember this. But this is Apple versus IBM. And IBM opened up its APIs, and if you want to count numbers of computers, they clearly won that battle. IBM doesn't make computers anymore. Apple still does. And the value proposition there, they talk about this as figuring out where the value is in the links and maintaining control of those, because the problem is once you open it up, there's no person or no actor that has the incentive to maximize the platform, because it's going to be too diffuse. And it's a really interesting set of literatures, and there's a competitive dynamic. If the first actor goes in open, go closed, or vice versa for differentiation and all this. There's a much more complex set of dynamics that I think is much more interesting. And then I find myself thinking about all this when the different aspects you talk about, the model, it's provocative. But the other question I have is, to what extent is it motivated by a monopoly model or an oligopoly model? So if you have a monopoly model, this is a very easy story to tell. If you have 3 actors, and I actually, we talked about this, I said Google is a third, but we also have Llama sitting out there, we have Amazon knocking, there are other people who want to be. So it's not like this is a closed number yet, for sure. But if you have a world in which that's the case, you may see other complementers trying to partner with some of these people, particularly the weaker ones, to try to actually push them forward. And so what I find myself is, if you look at the way we've studied this in economics, there are some industries, I think biotech in particular, where you have all independent actors and it's kind of mix and match. And that way it's readily open on every level. The counterexample classically is the car industry, where you have Toyota City, where you have dedicated parts manufacturers, the assembly, and then you have retailers which only sell Toyota cars, although that's starting to weaken, you see more and more. And the idea is, if there's enough synergies in integrating, whether it's laying off risk or technological coordination, the optimal outcome might be competition between 5 vertically integrated car manufacturers, as opposed to trying to make sure that every brake manufacturer can sell to every car manufacturer and then sell department store-like to every retail venue. And so there's a lingering question in this is, first, if it's an oligopoly model, there's dynamics that take place, but also even in that model, is a large vertically oriented structure of competing models necessarily bad? And the conclusion is we have to do the analysis. I wanted to make one quick question about ex ante. The way when I teach this, an ex ante rule is drive 55 miles per hour. An ex post rule is drive safely under the circumstances, and you can only find that out after the fact. Actually, competition law has a framework for answering this. Our default is case by case after the fact. We will do ex ante when you know what you're doing. So the problem with the 55 mile an hour, you have to know where to draw that line. Is that the right line? Should it be 70? Should it be 60? And we have to do that because we're going to apply this uniformly without thinking about it. And it's really helpful because you don't have to have big trials every time you do a speeding ticket. You have to know where to draw the line and how to draw the line. It has to be stable enough, and it has to, the phenomenon has to lend itself to simple policy inferences. That the way they say in antitrust speak, the practice is so rarely beneficial that you don't lose anything by banning it, or the game's not worth the candle. It's not worth the enforcement cost to catch those few cases where it's going to happen. And when you see vertical practices which tend to be ambiguous, and especially something in the very early stages, it's sort of a classic example. I always like frameworks. When do you do each? Because even if we have a decision, one or the other is right today, it's going to change. And so we need to know what changes and to think about this. We may get to the point where we can start to do this, but for AI, it seems to go, all this framework that I'm laying out for you, seems to say don't do ex ante now. It's because we don't know it well enough. It's too dynamic. And that, in fact, the inferences are ambiguous enough to do this. And that's one of the questions about exclusionary contracts, too, which is, the learning is exclusive dealing contracts can be both. And so they'd be good for consumers and bad for consumers. And then we have to do a more fact-based, effects-based analysis to really understand how different practices play out based on given market structures and the natures of the contracts.
Those are some great points. And just to draw out a theme that I'm hearing in a lot of your comments, Christopher, is that the framing of a lot of our questions and our analysis through the lens of harm and costs, but we may be missing the benefits and the value of some of these arrangements. So we should kind of look at it holistically from both sides. Did anyone else want to react to Elettra's, Asad?
Yeah, I really appreciated, Elettra, your framework. From being in government, and those of you who've been there have seen both sides of how this influence game works, both at a kind of how you set the terms of the debate, who's influencing what. One of the particular areas where I've seen this come up in AI that is interesting is the national security implications of AI. There are real serious national security questions of how AI models, and not just LLMs, but also like biodesign models, how they're used in contexts that implicate biosecurity, for example. And then there's a lot of hand waving from those specific national security concerns to AI is national security, therefore don't do anything. And that kind of pivot that happens a lot in these conversations is both frustrating, also not new, right? Like this isn't a unique industry that's done that. But I really appreciate your focus on power because the companies come in with a degree of power that is not just economic power, but is also cultural power and cachet. There's a lot baked into it that makes the debate harder. And so I really appreciate your way of laying that out.
I mean, just one sentence, having spent 12 years in the public policy team at Google, I think you've picked some very important factors to look into deeply. So thanks.
Great. Thanks to both of you. So Asad, this question is for you. So you've proposed an AI neutrality principle, AI model neutrality, which is maybe somewhat analogous to net neutrality. The core concern is unequal access in a way that privileges the provider's business concerns, but might disadvantage downstream users who depend on them. Can you explain what AI neutrality would require, maybe some examples that show this risk is real, and how this compares and contrasts to net neutrality, which seems to be less talked about these days than it was maybe 10 years ago?
You could talk to Tim if we want
Yes.
conversations about net neutrality. So the place I start is, as a society, the amount of energy, both actual like power, but also just focus on AI. In the last few years, you think about data centers, you think about everything that's happening in the chip market, you think about the CHIPS Act itself, a lot of it focuses on AI. And I start from what's the point? What do we actually want here? What do we as a society get? And I think the desirability is the innovation at the application layer. I, as an end user, as a citizen, don't care that much about the efficiency of chips on its own. I don't care that much about data centers. I don't care that much about model size, but I do care about the innovation that can be built on top of that. That can have implications for us. And I think there's a real question, and Brett laid it out really nicely, of are we getting anything really useful there? But if you assume that innovation at that layer is what matters, to me, everything else starts to look like infrastructure. And we think about data centers as infrastructure. We haven't thought about models as infrastructure as much. But when you look at Anthropic's Claude family of models, OpenAI's GPT models, the Gemini models, all of those have a consumer component, but increasingly they're looking like enterprise players where they make their tools available via an API to third-party innovators. That's all fine. We've seen that in many other domains as well. But where it gets complicated is these companies are competing with their customers. So let me give you an example of what that looks like. Last year, vibe coding took over the conversation. It went from kind of a Silicon Valley Twitter conversation to everybody's now playing with vibe coding in some way or another. A couple of independent companies really started to make splashes. The number 2 provider was a company called Windsurf. The way it operated, and Cursor and others do it this way too, is you have a model picker. You can decide which underlying model that AI coding agent is using. So you could pick a Claude model, you could pick DeepSeek's model, you could pick a whole host of them. And it had a default that Windsurf itself had developed based on Claude. So it was calling Claude's model using an API for that default model, which the way defaults work, that's what most people use. Bloomberg broke a story that OpenAI was going to acquire Windsurf. A few days later, Anthropic cuts off API access to Windsurf. And the thing about that kind of thing happens, but a TechCrunch reporter happened to be interviewing an Anthropic executive and asked, why'd you guys do this? And the answer was, we don't want to support OpenAI. They're one of our competitors. And at one level, I started my career in the private sector. When people talk about competition, hand-to-hand combat is messy. There's always messiness, and there will always be things that look from the outside impure or anything else. But these are tactics that are actually not that uncommon. But where it gets complicated for me as a policy question is, at the same time, Anthropic was really starting to develop. It had a public version of Claude Code, but it wasn't the kind of juggernaut that you see today. That's where it was going. And so it had an incentive to cut off Windsurf's API access. That was less than just we're competing with OpenAI. It was itself really developing a competitor to its own customer. That is complicated. And I think, Christopher, you've got a point of there are some benefits to vertical integration, and Claude Code being a great tool is an example of they built that tool based on their own model, specified in a way that has become useful. But where it gets, to me, as a competition question, where it gets complicated is the desirability. What we want is innovation at the application layer. What I don't want is infrastructure providers who can pick winners and losers. And that's the kind of dynamic, or at least the incentive structure that's starting to show itself as it has in other models. And so the proposal that a co-author and I have put forward, inspired by Tim's net neutrality work, thank you again for that, is the idea that you shouldn't be able to discriminate similarly situated customers, including ones that you are developing internally. But this isn't just a Claude and Windsurf issue. OpenAI has a startup fund where they've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in startups that use AI. So someone brought up the legal AI movement that we're starting to see with companies like Harvey. Well, OpenAI is invested in Harvey. If you want advancements in legal AI, that's a thing you might want, but you probably want the market dynamic of competition to determine what's a better tool, and you don't want the incentive structure of OpenAI having a desired preference because of their financial interests to favor one of the market participants. So that's where a neutrality-like rule can be helpful. Now, there are many of you who will wince, and many of you emailed me when I put the paper out with net neutrality in the title. Thank you for that. The way I think about this is net neutrality was not formally enacted in a way that would have, through regulation, stopped all the things we want. But it did give a language to what we want fair markets to look like. It did give us a way of calling out behavior that people thought publicly wasn't right. Now, I do think a regulation would have still been useful. The other thing I heard is, yeah, but everybody wanted net neutrality. We didn't get it. The sky didn't fall down. The internet didn't break. I don't think that's the threshold for how we should desire shaping markets or having regulations for fairness. It's not, is the sky going to fall down? No, it's not. I don't think absent an AI neutrality rule, the AI market will break. My question is, what do we want out of this market? And I think we want innovation at the application layer that impacts businesses, productivity, users. And one way to get that is to let the market decide rather than having big infrastructural players who have an increasing amount of power, both economic and political in other ways, decide that through other means. So that's the idea.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And we should acknowledge that Tim Wu, who's the originator of the idea of net neutrality, which is the idea that internet service providers and critical internet infrastructure providers shouldn't favor or disfavor companies' access and use of the internet in ways. And that was announced here at Colorado Law many years ago. So thanks. Helped inspire it.
So I have to thank Tim because I wrote the response, and I think of net neutrality as the gift that keeps on giving. I've been predicting its death since 2007 unsuccessfully. It's fascinating. By the way, when I was a new teacher, there's something called the AALS New Teachers Conference, and we got to have dinner, and with a senior person, and it was Bill Eskridge, who was, as you know, sort of founded the movement, the study of statutory interpretation. And his foil was Antonin Scalia. So I asked, what do you think of Scalia? And he said, I couldn't have done it without him. Mm-hmm. In some ways, we're in a university, this is about vibrant discourse. And this is really, and I would say, I don't know how, the dialogue I've had with Tim has been really helpful, I think, to pushing it forward. But just as scholars, it's been really productive and it's been helpful. So what do I say? I've already, we've talked about thank you, Asad. Vertical integration is ambiguous. It's got some benefits. I do think there's a question of the model is an oligopoly. We made that before. The other thing I would say is there's a literature that says access remedies are hard. And actually, if you look at what the DMA, the EU's implemented DMA, they're actually slow walking some of these remedies because they're really, and there's a nice science on this. I think of former FCC chief economist Jerry Fallhaber. There's lines in Breyer's concurrent dissent in Iowa Utilities Board. There's lines in Trinco. That you can't just put an access interface anywhere you want. And Carlos Baldwin has a nice thing on modularity. If things are too interdependent, it's a transaction-free zone. You can't actually force interfaces in certain places. And the more subtle they are and more complex they are, the harder it can be. But the other thing, to go back to a different idea that, and I love citing papers from this journal before. Shane Greenstein wrote a question about what does innovative health look like? And one of the things he said, his things were economic experiments, standards competition, and inventive entrepreneurship, which means that people are trying radically different things. And there's a fourth one was the absence of unilateral bargaining, which sort of cuts the other way, which is this way things work in good things because they're not all pushing in one direction. And there's another literature called dominant design literature, which is when you're trying to work through a new technology, if you try to standardize or do something before the dominant design has emerged, you're going to screw things up. And so the question is, there's an optimal timing to this. And it's quite possible that what you end up with in equilibrium, if what people want is, everyone wants the same things, design one API, everyone uses it. If people want different things, there's another equilibrium, which is you get differentiated API things targeted at different things in sort of the way that Richard was talking about with some things targeting enterprises. And figuring out which is the optimal solution takes time, but it's largely dependent on what the structure of demand is. And it's an interesting question to me, which we have to tease out a little bit.
All right, so thank you for that. And in the interest of time, let me pivot to Richard so we can leave some time for the audience. But Richard, on the state of large language models out there in the world, and you've said maybe the future is smaller, edge-based local models running on our devices or much closer. And then if that's the case, if we have small models running on our machines and our phones rather than out there, should we be concerned about loyalty or models acting in our best interest rather than the best interest of others?
Yeah, sure. So for starters, it's not entirely clear that LLMs are in fact going to be the end all and be all, even if they continue evolving. And there are a growing number of people in Silicon Valley. Gary Marcus has been at this for quite a while. He talks about LLMs are hitting a wall. Jan LeCun, who just left Meta a couple months ago to set up a new company based on a very different way of computing, talks about the entire industry has been LLM pilled. And the point is there were other ways of doing things than just the so-called stochastic parrot, to use a phrase from a paper from 2021, where some of the elements and the infirmities in the LLM model, things like reasoning creates order and anchoring biases, the symbol grounding is incomplete. We have, of course, hallucinations famously. Interpretability in terms of opaque inner workings is a real challenge. Plus, of course, all the enormous costs to deploy, right, in terms of data centers, chips, energy, and water. So there's something called, I think the movement is roughly called the AI Neo Labs. And these are alternative models, things like the world model that Jana's working on, active inference models, neurosymbolic AI, liquid neural models, diffusion language models, and a dozen more. They're just all some really crazy stuff. But some of that is getting some serious research attention and dollars. And it may well be in the next 3 to 5 years, LLMs are no longer the thing we're talking about. It may be a world model, which is more contextual, doesn't rely on text, uses much less power, et cetera, is the way that industry is moving. And what some of the folks are putting the heavy bets on, particularly OpenAI, may not in fact turn out. A second way to think about this is not just in terms of the foundational model, but also the distribution. And so we're seeing more hybridization around where the compute is happening, most of it moving towards the data. So by contrast to LLMs, we have small language models, SLMs, which are much cheaper, faster, easier to govern. They're domain specific, much smaller data set. In my coalition, the GleanNet Alliance, we have a company called Personal.ai who is building SLMs, and I think they're getting quite successful at it. And along with that, you're seeing NVIDIA now investing increasingly in chips that are moving to the edge. The telcos in the audience have talked for years about edge computing. Well, guess what? It may actually finally be here, and you may actually finally benefit from it because many of these chips are now going to go into the central offices, the cell towers, et cetera. Again, cheaper, stays closer to the source of the data, and these models don't have to know everything like an LLM. They need to know enough in context and act reliably. So I think this notion of the combination of it may be a different foundation, and whatever we do is probably going to be more distributed, means we're going to enter this hybrid space where I think some of these concerns we have may not be as germane. And the last point I'll make is, and getting to this idea of moving to applications, that's where you're seeing all the action today. It's the AI agents, right? It almost costs nothing to create an AI agent today. For both good and ill. You can have some amazing innovation. You can also have amazing fraud. So I gave a talk last summer in Lisbon where I talked about we were at that point in the summer of AI slop, right? The sort of the low quality content that we sort of find amusing or frustrating to deal with. I think we're now in the winter of AI fraud. I think because it's almost like spam 2.0, it's so easy to make these agents. They can go everywhere and they can find out ways to get themselves into your systems, into your computer, into your personal identity, and all of that. And I guess I'll leave with one observation. In that world, trust and accountability is all the more necessary. And that's where I think the rubber is going to hit the road in the policy and political side. When these agents start defrauding people left and right, creating real harms, I think consumer protection is going to rise to the fore. And that will be, I think, the linchpin for, I think, some of the regulatory efforts going forward. I'll mention, no one else has yet, multibook.com. Right, just came about in the last 10 days. It is a place where people can bring their agents to have AI to AI conversations. Humans are not allowed. In the relatively short time they've been doing that, these multis, there's like over 1 million agents in there now. They're building an ecosystem of their own. It's an active economy. They've got a religion. They're building political systems. And they talk about us as one of the big headers of one of the subchannels is bless their hearts, which is they talk about the limitations of their humans, but they love us anyway. There's been some disputes. I think there are some like humans now going there trying to create their own dynamics. But for the most part, it appears this is all really happening. These are really agents having these connections. And so while we're talking about LLMs and all this, and again, very important stuff, there are people building these applications going to take us very far, very quickly. And I don't think we're really ready for it.
Great. Those are some really interesting points. And I definitely agree with you that we're going to see more AI at the edge. That's where it's moving. Now, just from my standpoint, are LLMs going to hit a wall? I spend a lot of time studying this. I don't see this in any dimension. There's, 20, 30 different axes of improvement along these systems so continue to see them continuing along their pace, getting more performant each year, maybe somewhere around 10%. So I don't see any wall, but even though I do agree with you. All right, I want to open this up to audience questions. I will request very strongly that a student ask the first question, so we'll just sit here patiently. Oh, there we go. We have to keep the Phil Weiser rule, our Attorney General, intact.
Hi, good morning. Alec Khan, 1L here at Colorado Law. For those on the panel who advocate for a wait-and-see approach, I'm curious if you could identify specific conduct that would warrant antitrust intervention, and if so, what kind of intervention would be appropriate?
So the way we traditionally do this is we look for harms to consumer welfare, and we have models of how that could come about. And so, so when you look at sort of the vertically integrated models, how they could, and most of this is concerned. So, for example, the concerns Asad's worried about is locking out the complementers. We look at market structure filters on the front end to figure out when that's likely to create harm, and then look at other aspects to it to see going down the line. And an underappreciated thing is, can we fashion an effective remedy? Because we've learned the hard way in law that just because there's a problem, we can't always step in and fix it. There's a certain, there's an aspect about this that's called the precautionary principle, and that floats around out there, very popular in Europe, but Cass Sunstein at Harvard wrote something that is how I think about it, which is in the spirit of not to decide is to decide. If you prefer the status quo, unless you have some basis, principled reason for believing the status quo is better than the change, this is unprincipled. You're just sort of not, and you're putting your thumb on one scale in one direction. His exceptions were for when the consequences are catastrophic or irreversible. And I think that's a useful way to think about it as well, because, and as much as I think I love tech and I think it's very important, it's easy to think that all this is irreversible and catastrophic. I don't know, particularly in the world we're in now where no one's making money, I don't know that I have that big a concern.
All right, so we spent a lot of time talking about the work of Tim Wu, so it seems appropriate to, if you could wait for a microphone over there to allow Tim to comment.
Thanks, and if you allow me a comment and then a question for Asad and Christopher. It's a great panel. I really enjoyed this and thought it very thought-provoking. Can I just offer a comment on the China argument, or discussion, which I think was put out there in an earlier question to Brett and has been discussed intermediately. One of the things I became interested in recently is looking at China's perspective on the AI race and other perspectives and how they see it. I mean, I think it's unquestionable that China sees itself in a race for economic supremacy with the United States and is very interested in winning that race. But when you look carefully at the Chinese approach, it is not an approach that thinks that the AI race is the one that's going to determine it. If you look at China, they're betting really hard on electric vehicles, solar panels, advanced manufacturing, batteries, a whole series of. It's kind of like a distributed bet. Well, in fact, it feels more like the United States is making a very strong bet on AI mainly. And so when you think about, well, if you want to prevent the world being taken over or dominated by China in the future, we might want to ask whether we want to diversify our bet a little bit, because if it doesn't turn out that AI is the be, I mean, maybe it will, maybe it won't, but we are making a very, very big bet on one technology, and it's not one that China's making. When you look at the source of the idea that China's betting everything on AI, it's all American sources that believe that, and most notably an essay by Eric Schmidt, where it all seems to start and lead to a certain kind of conclusion. So I just wanted to put that out there, that I don't think China is thinking about this in that way. Asad, I want to ask you about the paper. I've enjoyed the report and read it, and I just want to comment that I think the key is something you said at the beginning. If you look back at the internet and this sort of similar conversation about 25 years ago, if we look in retrospect, the value really was in the applications, right? Like, it didn't end up being, well, what did what great apps did Verizon offer that really changed the world, or whatever it was. It ended up being the applications on top, and that ended up being which we now have become concerned about their power, but Netflix, Google, Amazon, all these user applications. And so the question in my mind about unlocking the maximum value in AI, a really under-discussed thing, is whether the platformization of AI is going to be important to unlocking the full value of that technology. I guess the question I have for you is, in what ways do you think, or have you thought, that the internet circa, let's say, 2000 is similar or different to the situation with AI today in terms of platformization? There's obviously a lot of differences. One thing that strikes me is it was never the ambition of Google to get acquired by Verizon. Like, that wasn't their dream. And it strikes me that, one different thing about the ecosystem is there is a lot of AI app makers whose ambition is to be acquired. So maybe that, is one big difference. But I'm interested in anyone reflecting on ways in which the metaphor, agreeing with the idea that there's a huge amount of value to be unlocked on a neutral network with applications. How are things different? How are they similar? And I see Howard nodding, so maybe Howard wants to talk about that too.
I'll kick it off quickly and want others to jump in. And thank you for that great question. There are differences in the technological layers, right? I do think that an ISP in transferring data packets is different from an LLM or many different other types of multimodal models or foundation models. And it is a little bit, to me, premature to say that market is fixed. Although when I talk to my friends at startups, they do see Anthropic, Gemini, and OpenAI's models as largely commodities, where shifts in prices actually do make them, they've architectured their own technologies to be able to shift quickly, because pennies here or there end up mattering for API calls. All that said, the where the innovation happens that matters, I think that point to me continues to be a similar analog. The companies wishing to be bought, I think, is real, but also I think it's fair to say that OpenAI is also not making profits, right? All these companies combined have a huge negative profit number. All of that shaking out, to me, is a little bit different, because the ISPs were making money. They weren't net unprofitable at the time. So all of that feels a little bit different in that it'll probably push for business models that could be really extractive, and surveillance business models and others that I worry a lot about.
And then, there is a difference, which is, I think, we talk about innovation, and maybe I see more innovation, maybe not. But the other thing is investment. When you go to the Breyer concurrence and all the all the access cases, those remedies work best when the existing platform you're allocating has essentially been built out, and you're allocating access to basically a facility that already exists. And that's not at all clear that that's going on right now. And so the analogy is the platform is much less mature in terms of both its direction and its money. I wanted to go to your China comment. I wanted to plus one what Asad said. The national security argument is right now used to obscure. And we need tools to we do this with vertical practices. We develop tools or to say, when does this make sense? We don't have those tools. And to throw this out, this is my concern, oddly enough, Elettra, about capture theory, is we had great ambitions that would give us prescriptive guidance, and it's mostly been good for autopsies. What went wrong, but the ability to turn public choice theory into usable policy has been, to many people, disappointing. And so the question is are we going to get enough structure out of it to be able to get the leverage we need?
And last comment goes to Richard, 30 seconds.
Yeah, because I was at Google, I was fairly familiar with their experience. And I think back in 2000, or just shortly after with the dot-com wreckage, they quietly behind the scenes started buying up very cheap access to dark fiber. And then over the years, they built data centers, they undersea cables, they got into a spectrum auction. So they went from the application layer to starting to build out the infrastructure that made their applications work faster and more efficiently. So they created sort of this positive feedback loop between the two sides. So to me, it felt like it starts the applications, and then they went for the infrastructure to go along with that.
Well, please join me in thanking this amazing panel here. Really productive discussion.